Order. It is 9:14 a.m. on Tuesday, January 12th. The introductions of our commissioners will begin on my right.
Dominique Cobb, Urban Planner.
Vivian Salaga, Preservation Architect.
Patricia Ortiz, Urban Planner.
Missy Shoecraft, Preservationist.
And has everyone had an opportunity to have a look at the minutes? And are there any comments or questions regarding those? Hearing none, may I have a motion to accept the minutes as submitted?
I'll make a motion to accept the minutes.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Minutes are accepted. We now have announcements from Dennis Fernandez, the HPC Administrator for the City of Tampa.
Good morning, Commissioners. Dennis Fernandez, Architecture Review and Historic Preservation Manager. This morning we do have limited time, so we want to kind of jump into the agenda. I'm going to forego announcements. Is it necessary to do ex parte communication, Kamaria?
I will just to.
Okay.
Good morning, Kamaria Pettis-Mappa from the City Attorney's Office. Will the Commissioners state whether or not there are any ex parte communications regarding the two items that are on the agenda? And seeing none for the record. Additionally, have any of the Commissioners had any conflicts of interest regarding the items that are on the agenda? Additionally, none for the record. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Moving on, we will skip the swearing this morning because there is not going to be any action required by the Commission. So we're going to move to item number 7, which is the Ybor City Design Guidelines is our subject. And as you are aware, over the last year or so, I've been giving you updates on the progress that we have been making with securing a consultant to assist in the update of the Ybor City Design Guidelines. The current guidelines were drafted or actually finished in 1986. That was an addition, that was already a revision from 1984. So they have been in place for quite a long time. There's been some updates to them over the years, but they're at a point where we have a need to comprehensively update them. And we have secured the firm of S&ME to assist us with this. Today's presentation is an overview of the firm, their team, and the process. We're going to leave time at the end for questions and for discussion on how this update will procedurally occur with the Commission. The Commission's powers and duties do reference the responsibility of the HPC to periodically update the existing district guidelines. We're going to be working under that. This part that occurs before your formal consideration of the draft is an effort to not only convey to the public and to our users that we're going through this process, but to also receive feedback from the HPC on any particular areas of concentration that they would like to see. So I will just open the floor briefly to our legal counsel, and then we'll turn it over to the consultant. Thank you.
Good morning again. Kamaria Pettis-Mappa from the City Attorney's Office. I just wanted to remind the board that your third authority to review the design standards is under Code Section 27-264, design standards, specifically referencing subsection B, which is regarding to existing districts. Excuse me. Obviously, when we get closer to the HBC making additional comments or suggestions or approval of the proposed guidelines, that will be a public hearing, and that code section provides additional standards that have to take place. So I just want to remind the board where your authority is based on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, our consultant will now come up. This is Patricia Chayeski, who is leading the effort, and I'll turn the floor over to her. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay with the mask?
Yes.
No? Okay. So my name is Pat Tayeski, and I am the Planning Director for SNME. We're based in Orlando. I have a very short presentation today. It's the same presentation that we use for the kickoff with staff. It's just to give you an idea of what we're going to be working on in the next few months. So we're going to talk about the project scope, we're going to talk about the schedule, and the team that we have put together. We're going to talk a little bit about the current standards, and then we're going to talk about the current draft that staff has already started, and we'll talk about what's next. In terms of the project scope, it is a very straightforward scope. We're going to start with the kickoff meetings, and the idea is that we want to hear from the different stakeholders. We want to hear from staff, we want to hear from the Historic Preservation Commission, from the Barrio Latino. We want to know what has worked in the past and what hasn't, so that way we're better informed when we start working on the standards. Then we get into the draft guidelines and public input. We will produce drafts, we'll have reviews, have meetings, and do this process for several months, and then we go to adoption. When we look at it, I guess I have the schedule later. In terms of the applicability of these standards, it is our understanding that they will apply to the local district. We have very different boundaries shown on this map, the national district, the local district, but our understanding is that the standards will apply to the gray boundary, the dark gray boundary. For the schedule, so the kickoffs, we started this process in December. We already had the kickoff with staff, and then we're going to have the kickoff with you, and then staff is going to have the kickoff with the Barrio Latino. We also expect to start establishing contact with stakeholders. We have also started working on the actual draft. So we are reviewing the current code, we're reviewing the draft, and starting to come up with recommendations. We will come back to meet with staff at the end of February and look at what we have put together, get some comments from them, revisions. Then we will come back to the Historic Preservation Commission, do the same, and so forth, until we get to July, when we expect to be ready to start going through the adoption hearings. So the team. So I'm leading the effort, but I'm also working with Eddie Browder, who's present today. We have worked together on many historic preservation projects in the past. We serve as the historic preservation officers for the cities of Melbourne and Titusville in Brevard County. But helping us, we have a team of landscape architects and planners, and also a senior graphic designer. We also are going to be working very closely with staff. They, as Dennis mentioned and I mentioned, they had already started a draft in the past. We're not going to just forget about that and start, from scratch. There is a lot of information already that had been put together, so we're going through that draft too. And of course, the stakeholders. We have talked about a few people that we would like to incorporate into this process and have communication with them. But if the Commission has any recommendations on who else we should consider, we will welcome that. So the current guidelines. So when we looked at the draft, understanding that it was very old, a little bit outdated, some of the graphics were not that great anymore. The outline, however, is simple. It's easy to understand. You have some general standards, then you talk about landmark rehabilitation, you talk about commercial structure rehabilitation, and then residential. The question, however, is when we go to the district and look at the different buildings, and we think about that booklet, those standards, what has worked and what hasn't? Is there something that we wish we had in writing that maybe it's not there yet? Or is there something that just creates trouble by having it in the standards? So those are the questions that we want to hear from everybody. And again, we're talking about new construction, we're talking about rehabilitation, many different types of activities. So when we write these standards, we want to be clear on when it is important to consider what's there now in terms of the site versus what's in the district. So when we're talking about new construction, do we need to have references to some landmark buildings already in the district? So in terms of the current draft, so we started reviewing it. The outline pretty much includes general standards, new construction, and rehabilitation, and some miscellaneous. But when we look at each section, we're going through it and looking at, okay, so this is just the introduction. Do we need all that information in that chapter? When we talked with staff, we realized that there may be some things in that chapter that could be in an appendix that don't necessarily have anything to do with a developer coming in, trying to do construction rehabilitation. So we will be looking at where those sections should go. The second part has to do with maintenance of existing buildings. So this is where we start getting into the part of what kind of standards we need to put in place. Then we go into the new construction section. Now, this section, I think, is the one that is going to have the most changes, and it is because we're going to be injecting a little bit of urban planning into it, because it's not so much about the windows and the doors, but it's also the placement of the building, the bulk of the building, how it relates to neighboring structures. So we're going to have graphics, and think of it kind of like a form-based code, where it gives you more information than just the architecture of the building. And then section 4, right now it's a miscellaneous section, and we'll see if some of those subsections can be moved to the other chapters. So these two sections may have a little bit of reorganization too. The next steps, so we've had 2 kickoff meetings by now, and the next one is going to be with the Barrio Latino Commission, and staff is going to be conducting that one. And then we expect to have the stakeholders' input, and then we're going to kind of disappear for a little while where we make the assessments and come up with recommendations, and then come back and touch base with staff. So if you have any comments, suggestions, questions, Eddie and I are all ears and would like to hear from you.
I have one comment, if this is the appropriate time? Yes or no?
Is Dennis, is this appropriate for us to make comments and questions now?
So this morning's discussion is more interactive. You're not going to be taking any action, so feel free to ask questions and have discussion.
Okay.
Okay, so my question is about the stakeholders. Can you tell me a little more about who you're going to be talking to? What's the outreach?
That's something that we're going to be relying on staff to get input from them, and they'll be giving us names and numbers and emails so that we can gather these people. When we had the kickoff, we talked about some groups, and I would invite Dennis to give you more information on who they are. But
Yes, Dennis Fernandez with the staff. We are developing a list for the consultants to utilize. It will include just historically the groups that have been engaged in Ybor City. So that's going to include obviously the neighborhood associations, the various firms that routinely do business within the Ybor City Historic District, the Ybor City Development Corporation, the Ybor City Museum Society, the Ybor City Chamber, and we are going to try to be as inclusive as possible. Our outreach method is a little bit open right now because most of our efforts are going to have to be virtual. So we'll have to organize that appropriately. We don't have a lot of opportunity to do in-person meetings like we would typically go out into the neighborhood and advertise for that type of meeting, which is a little bit of an unknown right now. We'll see what the environment looks like when we start getting into the spring. But if you have any suggestions for groups that you think would be interested in participating in this discussion, please let the staff know, and we'll make sure that they are contacted.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
And do we let the staff know that now or at some point in the future? Or we could just give you a call if we think of someone whom we think might be important to include?
Yeah, you can just simply email us or give us a call. This is all going to be information that's publicly available. If someone cares to participate that's not in one of those organizations, they're more than welcome to. We'll be reaching out to the AIA local chapter as well to let them know that this is underway and to allow them to engage in the process. And we totally recognize that once we begin to publicize this like we are at this morning's meeting, that there's going to be a high degree of interest and we're going to have a lot of participation. Mm-hmm. That's really what we want because we want to have a robust document at the end of this process that is a relevant resource to not only the Barrio Latino Commission, who regularly applies that in its certificate of appropriateness process, but also to individuals that live in the district, individuals that work in the district, professionals that engage in projects, or just preservationists that are interested in recommendations on appropriate treatments.
Well, it's a big district, so it's bound to, I'm hoping that it will be bound to generate a lot of interest. This was quicker than I had anticipated your presentation would be. Is there any other further comment you would like to make at this time?
No, I mean, we're just getting started, so it's pretty much just hearing from the community, hearing from you. If you have any, suggestions or comments, we're all ears at this point. When we come back later with standards, you'll hear a lot of talking from our side.
Okay, great.
I think one thing to kind of consider as you're sort of processing this information and perhaps coming up with a list of topics that you want to review, pay special attention to, is that there's the existing guidelines when written were really focused on the rehabilitation and adaptive reuse of historic properties. So there's a lot of information in there about restoring storefronts and how you change a building from one purpose to another purpose and meet codes and whatnot. As we move into these guidelines with the where we are today with Ybor City as a historic district, this document actually predated Ybor City as a national landmark district. It's been around that long. So as we move in, we're going to be paying special attention to the new construction sections of this document and the sort of the miscellaneous, because the miscellaneous is really very has a big impact. So you're talking about modern equipment and pertinent fixtures and what the public typically would interact with on a more routine basis than perhaps not keying into something as obvious as the siding of a building. So those areas are going to be very important to kind of work through to keep the standards. We're moving from guidelines to standards to keep the standards relevant for today, but also able to sort of grow with the district, because we don't have the resources, unfortunately, to do this very often. So when we do it, we want to try to create a document that can kind of evolve as the district evolves. And as you've seen from 1984, we went from a district that was really in recovery to something that's very vibrant urban village now that has a lot of development pressures for density, for types of buildings that weren't really envisioned in the 80s, like public parking garages or private parking garages. So there's some interesting topics that really aren't covered in the guidelines for new construction. We've often relied on the Secretary of the Interior's standards to bolster some of the deficiencies in the rehabilitation section of the guidelines. So we're also hoping to somewhat shore those up with additional information from federally accepted preservation practices that can be applied at the local level.
Yeah, I would hope that if it is at all possible, to create some language in there that is a little bit stronger than it is recommended that. Because I know from my years on the Architectural Review Commission that so many people have come before that commission seeking to do things that the guidelines did not offer enough tooth to be able to enforce adherence to some of the guidelines that were in the documents for those other historic districts in the city. And I know it's a tricky fine line to walk, but I would hope that somehow it might be able to be accomplished this time so that this revision could serve as a guide for revising the other historic district guidelines as well.
And that was something that Dennis mentioned, that we're going from guidelines to standards. The difference is a guideline, you take it or
It's
leave it.
Big
But-
difference,
So
yes.
the other one is
Good.
gonna be more like, you shall do this, or you have the option of this or that.
And I don't know how maintenance falls into it. I know that many times within the city, we've come upon building owners or property owners who request demolition by neglect, quite frankly. And it's a shame that some of these historic structures in the city have come to that point where by negligence of the owner in just doing some minimal maintenance over the years, the buildings have deteriorated significantly. And then they complain because it's going to cost so much to have to rehab it in its more deteriorated condition. So hopefully that might be something that these standards could also address, that might be able to be adopted by the other guidelines in the future as well.
Sure.
One of the things I'd just like to note is that I think when reading these guidelines, it would be important to tie together like all of the requirements, parking, signage, so that we don't have to flip through the code to get from one section to another to see what would be allowed. I think it should be pretty well stated within the guidelines what's required.
Yeah, the only problem when we do that is that we end up repeating a code that could change, and then you end up with conflicts. So later people will say, well, you're requiring so many parking spaces here in your standards for the historic district, but in the code it says something else. And then it puts you in a situation of, when was that changed? Should we have changed the standards? So we believe in making it user-friendly, but we have to avoid ending up with conflicts. So
Okay.
we'll try our best to do that, or at least to refer to specific sections where people can
That-
go and refer to it.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, just
restating.
because we want to limit that ambiguity,
Yes.
of like what's required. Exactly.
Exactly.
Very good.
Or even if it could be offered as an addendum, so perhaps it's not part of the official document that gets adopted, but certainly I agree that that is a big issue, especially with the non-professional folks that are looking at these guidelines. If you could have something that could be updated if in fact the code changes, say, 2 to 2.5 parking spaces, I found that that's very helpful in other districts. Kind of one-stop shopping.
Yeah, and
It does require more effort from the staff because they have to update that addendum when there's a change to the code, but there are not that many changes, frankly, to the zoning code.
Right.
Yeah, and sometimes it's good to have like a brochure, something very simple that says, okay, I'm gonna do something to my building. What are the steps? You go to this document, you go to that document, make sure you remember to get a permit. So something like that can help them. At least put in one page the pieces and parts they have to be aware of. That helps too.
And I might add, include the realtors in that, because
Oh,
we have
gosh.
found over the years that realtors are more interested in selling their building than selling it with accurate information to the prospective buyer. Sorry.
No, yeah, that's very good. Just one of my observations is that a lot of the lots in the Ybor City area are very small, and the trend is to sort of overpack that lot. So if we could just be clear from the beginning what the expectation is, you know, and I think a lot of this will come out in the stakeholders meeting, but one of the problems that I see as a planning and zoning consultant is that people purchase these small lots in Ybor City, and they really have very lofty expectations of what they can do there. And I think if we can kind of contain some of that, you know, very grand expectation from the beginning, we could save some time and aggravation in the end by going through variance process and pleas to the Barrio Latino. So just something to think about.
Yeah, that's something that we like to take into consideration, especially when we do, for example, bonuses for height or density. It's like not everybody's going to be able to utilize this bonus because you also have to consider the neighbors, you also have to consider the size of your lot, where you're located. So it's kind of like putting a disclaimer before you, yeah. That's I understand
Managing
what you're saying.
expectations. It's important.
Any other comments? None? All right, thank you very much.
Yeah,
We're
thank you.
really looking forward to this because its impact is going to be dramatic.
And we're very excited to be working on this.
Thank you.
And just a final thought, we will be obviously a big contributor to this effort. It's going to be the Barrio Latino Commission, who has that firsthand knowledge of utilization of the current design guidelines. So I'll be, as the presentation said, reaching out to them at their next public hearing with a similar presentation. And we'll have future workshops jointly with the HPC and the Barrio Latino Commission to ensure that we're kind of working through issues that are obviously important to them that we may not be aware of as a body who is not in that regulatory role. So I'll be reaching out to them on the 26th of this month, and then we'll proceed with the schedule that was presented to you in the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair. Madam Chair.
I'm sorry.
May I go? I know that there's not a vote on the next item, is there?
I'm sorry, what?
I need to leave. I want to make sure there's not a vote on the next item.
There is not. We were informed, unfortunately, that we were going to lose our quorum, so we wanted to make sure
Oh,
that,
sure.
that
No, this is,
we got this in for this morning. But the next item was just informational with Preservation Park. We are going to be bringing that back to you in March for the public hearing. We've been consulting with both the state and the federal regulators because that is part of the Florida State Park System. So that was just an update for you to let you know that in March you can expect to see that on the agenda. And other than that, that's concludes the staff's business for the day.
Okay. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you very much, Missy, for making the
Not
time
at
to
all.
come.
Happy to do it.
Our next meeting is on March 9th, 2021, 9 a.m., and I'm assuming it will still be in this location until further notice.
We're actually going to be reaching out to you on the locational issues after this meeting, but it will be on March, and we will notice that in accordance with the code.
Very good. Do any commissioners have any other new business they would like to bring forward?
No,
None?
thank you.
Seeing none, then I declare we are adjourned at 9:43 a.m.